Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about building your very first workflow with Conductor. Um, so the easiest way to get started is to go to the Conductor playground, and you can access that by going to the Orcus website at orcus.io and click on the playground link right here. That will lead into the Conductor UI that looks something like this. So before we get started, a quick primer on the basic concepts in Conductor. So if you go to the documentation website, you will find under the concepts, there are three basic things to look at. The very first thing is what we call a task. And task is basically the kind of the very fundamental building block. And you can think of tasks representing what you build as a developer, right? It could be a microservice, it could be a web service, it could be a long-running background job, it could be a shell script, it could be anything. It could be basically any piece of code that's running, and you can create a task around it, right? So that's number one. And what do we do with this task? We need to create a workflow with this task. And so workflows are basically a DAG. It's a call graph of how you're actually calling your task. And you can do that. Here's an example workflow, by the way, in Conductor, right? The diagram on the right here shows a DAG of how workflow is represented. You can see the definitions right here. And on the right side, you can actually see the viewer where you can actually visualize how your definition looks like. And these square boxes right here are the tasks that we just talked about. And to create your graph, Conductor also has this concept of operators. And think of operators as general programming language constructs that you would see in any programming language, right? Think about your do-while loops, your switch case statements, which we call decision tasks in Conductor. Very often you want to run fork and join things. There's concepts of fork and dynamic fork, where you can actually run a bunch of things in parallel. There's a concept of a join operator, where you can join and wait on a bunch of things to happen. There's an actual wait task which let you sleep and wait on something to happen. And you have a bunch of operating constructs that's actually defined in Conductor. So now you have two basic things. One is your lower level task, which you kind of that's the basic building block, and then you use a bunch of these operators to construct a workflow like this. The square boxes that you see here are basically tasks, and these tasks represent the code that you write. It could be a microservice, it could be a web service, it could be written in any language of your choice. Okay? And there's a bunch of these operators out here, right? So for example, this loan type operator, it's a named operator, right? It's basically, think of this as a switch case statement. It's looking at a bunch of values, and based upon the values, it's executing a bunch of different tasks, right? And there are other things like fork and do while, which we will go over in other examples, but that's how you construct your workflow, right? Now that we have seen the very basic concepts, let's go and actually build out your very, very first workflow here. So to build your workflow, the first thing you need to do is either use an existing task, or you can go and define a task of your own. So let's go and define your own task here, right? The first thing you need to do is go to this task definitions tab right here and click on define task, and that gives you a template of the basic properties in a task, right? So let's go and build this thing out right now, right? So the first thing is the name. The name is basically has to be something that's unique. So let's call it Hello World Test, and a one-liner description of what that task really does. And there are two things. This is actually basically serving as documentation, but think of task as similar to if you're programming in Java, you actually building a method, and the way the method operates is you have a bunch of input parameters, function arguments basically, and you do a bunch of work based on those input parameters, and then you return an output. And this is very analogous to that, right? So you have a bunch of input keys. In this case, just one key, and then we are going to call that name right here. You could have multiple of these. And again, like, also saying, hey, what are the bunch of output keys that this task will generate when it's done, right? And in this case, it's just one output key called message, right? And these are, there's a few other properties that you see right here. And these are things that you can configure to make your microservice, the underlying code that's sitting under this, to make it more resilient. So for example, when this task is executed, it's possible that there's a transient failure and your microservice is not up and running, or there's a transient network error, and very often you'll need to build some retry logic into it. So that comes out of the box with Conductor. So there are things like this, like, hey, how many times do you need to retry? And if you're going to retry, what's your policy for retrying? Is it fixed? Is it an exponential backoff? And what's the delay in seconds between each retry, right? And there are also other things like, hey, how do we time out on a particular task if it's not responding? There's some other properties like rate limiters, right? So very often when you are giving this task out for other folks to use, because the whole notion of Conductor is that you can build these components as very reusable components, like you build these tasks and other workflows can actually use them. But sometimes you want to build some rate limiting into these things, and so you can actually set rate limiting functions like how often you want to rate limit, what's the frequency in seconds, and other things. And we'll go over these things in much in detail in another video, right? But the basic things: name, bunch of input keys and output keys, and then you should be able to get started with this. So let's go save off your first task. And when you save, you get a diff of what existed before, which versus what it is right now. So we started with an empty task, and here's where we are right now. Let's go and confirm and save this. So your first task definition is actually saved. Let's go make sure that exists here. So you can see this in your task repository right now. You have a hello world test, and this is how it looks like. So the next step is to basically write some code behind this, right? So let's go do that. All right, so now let's look into implementing the Hello World test worker. And here I'm choosing Java to implement the worker. So the Java SDK that comes bundled with Conductor has an interface called worker that you can go and implement. But before we do that, let's take a quick look and see what exactly the interface provides, right? So there's two main things that you have to look at, right? So one is basically saying which task is this worker being implemented for, and you can define your task definition name over here, and then the actual logic of execution, right? And that goes into implementing an execute function right here. So let's went and actually build this hello world test worker class right here that's implementing the worker interface, and overrode the two methods that we just talked about, right? So one was the task definition name, and we're basically saying, hey, just return the name of that. That's called hello world test, and that's because when you defined your workflow, this is the name you gave that, right? This is basically what it should be mapping to. And the next piece is to do your execution of the task, right? So when the task gets executed, you get a task object that has all the information that you need to go and execute your task, right? So again, if you go back to how a task works, the worker gets a bunch of inputs. just like you defined here. Your input keys that you defined here. In this case, just one, and you call that name. And you need to extract that out from the task object. The way you do that is to look into the input data and then get the value of the input which has a key called name, right? And then because you know that it's a string object, uh, store that in a variable and then do something cool with that, right? And then when you're done doing your stuff, and this might be maybe if it's a machine learning program, it might be actually getting data, from an ML model, or it might be you might be actually talking to a database and getting some interesting information out. You might be calling another service, and getting some, it might be a lookup service that's looking up, user information, or anything else that you want to do here, right? And then once you're done with your job, you've used your inputs, finish what you needed to do. And the next thing that you need to do is get the results and then add it to the output data, right? And similar to how we got the input data, you can add output data and you can define what keys you defined in a task definition. So your output keys are right here. And in this case, we basically told that it's got just one key called message, and we're actually writing the value of that, and this is how we did it, right? So if you pass in conductor as the name, then you'll get a message back saying hello world conductor. And once you're done setting your outputs, go and set the status of this to completed, and then return the result, right? So that's all you need to do to implement your first worker, right? So let's look at one more thing on how, what happens when your application comes up and running, right? So this is a very simple um, hello world application. It's written in it's a Java app written in Spring Boot. So look at the startup code for that, right? Like here's the most important piece of that, right? So you define a list of workers. In my project, I have a bunch of other workers right here, but we are just dealing with the hello world test worker. So everything that's defined as a service or a component will get wired in here. And you are building a task runner configure right here, and this is like default thing that you're going to put it into your startup code. All it says is, hey, wire up all your workers, put up a thread pool size, and soon after that, you are initializing your configurer. And what this is going to do is basically start polling the conductor server and asking it for work. And while it's doing that, it's also going to tell the conductor server that, hey, I have a bunch of workers that I've implemented, and if you have any work for me that's for any of the workers that are defined here, give me that work. And when conductor finds something, when someone executes a workflow, is when a call comes back here, and then you do your execution and put your results back. And when you're done writing the results and setting the status, this worker or this client SDK is going to take that and then give it back to the conductor server saying, hey, you asked me to do a job with a bunch of inputs. I did that. Here's my output. And once conductor gets the data, it updates the state of the workflow, marks that specific task is complete, and then moves on to the next task, and so on and so forth. So now let's see this in action. We went through two steps right now. We took the task, we defined a task in conductor, we went and implemented the worker and wrote the code behind that, right? So the next step is basically to go and use that task in the workflow. So let's go and create a workflow out of it. So to create a workflow, go to the workflow definitions tab right here and click on the define workflow button. And this brings up the workflow creation editor. This is the authoring UI. And let's go build this, create this workflow out. So I had this workflow predefined before, so we're just going to use the time and just walk you through this. So a few things to look at, right? Just like we had this name property in the task. We also have this name property in the workflow. And that needs to be a unique name, a brief description of what this workflow does, a version number, and versions are very key because you can change the workflow definitions irrespective of how your tasks are defined and where it's being used. And so you can keep the workflow definitions very, very decoupled from the task and the worker implementation. And when you update your workflows over time, and basically this is where your business logic is, right? You can actually version this accordingly. This is the most important thing. Like, how do you basically use the task that you just built out in your workflow, right? So this is a very simple task. This is a very simple workflow, just one task in here. And if you look at the task property, it's basically telling you that it's an array of task objects. In this case, just one element in this thing. And what we are saying here is use the hello world test task that you just defined earlier on and give it a unique reference name because technically you can have multiple representations or uses of the usage of this task within the same workflow. You can actually call this task somewhere else in the workflow, so you need to have a unique name for that task in this particular workflow. So think of this as your class name and your object name, right? And the input parameters, right? So if you remember earlier on, like, when we defined the task, we expected this task to have one input parameter. And that's what we're doing right here. We're saying, hey, here's this task expects an input parameter, but where do we get this input parameter from? And this is one of the very important features of Conductor. You can wire in the input parameters from either a set of inputs that the workflow itself has, or you can wire in the inputs from an output of any task that was executed prior to this, right? In this example, we're just taking in the inputs from the workflow itself. So we're saying, hey, workflow has an input called name, and we're just going to use that as the value of the name parameter for this task. And we don't need to go over all of these other cases in this particular thing, but the only other important thing to keep in mind here is the type of the task, and it's going to be a simple task in most cases. So that's kind of defining your task right here. The next thing is to basically, because this is a workflow definition, just like we had input and output parameters for the task, we also have input and output parameters for the workflow. And in this case, we are saying, hey, the workflow has an input parameter called name, and the output parameters, it also has an output parameter called message, and the output parameter in this case is going to be wired in from the output of the task that you just defined here. So here's the unique reference name of this task in this workflow. And what we're saying right here is go to that particular task when it gets executed, go to the output of that task, pull out the message field for that, and then use the value of that as the value of this output parameter, which happens to be the output parameter of the workflow itself. There are other stuff that's we'll probably talk about in a future video, but this is all that you need to get up and running. So go save this up, and you can quickly see a diff of what's changed. Confirm that, and we have your very first workflow defined, and you can see that the UI has also refreshed that, and you can actually see this stuff in the UI as well, right? All right, and this is one way to define your workflow. This is a workflow definition, and as I said, like, the workflow definition is completely decoupled from the way you define your tasks and the way you write your code, your task worker code that sits behind the task. And this is one way to do it. You can actually represent your definition in JSON, but there are other ways as well, but we will talk about that in a future video. So once you've saved that, the next step is to go run that thing out, right? So to run a workflow, you basically need to do two things. Let's go run this workflow out. So to run this workflow, hit on the run button right here, and then just let's go pick up the hello world test. In this case, pick out the version that you want to do. And then you can see that, when you pull out the version, Conductor basically goes and pulls out the definition, figures out what's the input parameters that this workflow needs, right? And populates that in the UI so that's easy for us to go and run this. So this expects a name parameter, and let's give this value call this conductor, and just let's hit run. And when you hit the run button, it actually gives you the ID of the workflow that you just created, and you can just click on this, and it takes you to this, and when you hit on that, it will actually take you to this execution tab, which you can actually see a list of, you can actually see that workflow in action. And one thing you notice here is that it's still actually waiting for it to be run. That's why it's actually showing up as blue, and you can see the status that's it's set to running. So how do we make sure that this thing is executed, right? So our worker code is still not doing anything. So let's actually run this application right here. And let's actually run this in debug mode so we can actually inspect this as things are coming along. So right before that, let's quickly go back into what happens when you bring up this application, right? So this is the actual workflow, the worker implementation. And you might have, other worker implementations, in this project, right? But if you look at the startup code for this, let's take a quick look and see what's actually the startup code doing right here. Right? So it's doing two things. The first thing, it's actually telling you, hey, listing out which Conductor server it's listening to, right? So if you're actually using the playground, the thing that you need to do right here is basically go to your application properties, and this is a Spring Boot based project, right? So I'm going to set the Conductor server URL property to playapp.orcus.io/API, which is basically what you need to point Conductor to so that it can the client can actually do its work, right? So if you look at it, the Conductor client, the worker client right here, it's basically when it boots up, it's going to have a small worker pool, and it's going to poll the Conductor server and ask it for work. And it's going to tell Conductor server that here's a bunch of workers that I know about that this application is configured to work with. And when it's polling for work, if it finds any workflow with a task, so when it's polling for work, if it finds any workflow that has a task called hello world test in the example, or any other worker that this particular application implements, Conductor will say, hey, I've got some work for you. Here's the information you need to do your job, and that information basically is a bunch of inputs, and the worker does its job and produces the output and gives it back to Conductor, so that Conductor can go and update the state and move on to the next task in the workflow. So now let's actually run this thing in debug mode, and let's see what's going on with this. So let's bring this thing up, and So we're going to talk about some security features that we have in the playground. And you can actually skip this section if you're actually using the open source version of Conductor and have deployed this locally. You don't need to go through this step. But if you're using the playground, one of the things that it provides is to put some security around it to make sure that whoever is polling for work to be done, right? So the task workers, like, and they are authorized workers, and that's what this is trying to, that's what you're trying to do here. So to do that, if you're in the playground, go to the applications tab right here, and then create an application. I've already created one called Conductor Learning App right here, and you can name it whatever you want. And basically it's saying that, hey, this application, there's an application ID right here. It tells you that, hey, it puts all the security related features under this application, right? Now, the next thing to do is, create some kind of access keys right here, right? So if you go and hit that pencil button right there, and the first thing that you need to do is do something like this. So you need to say that, hey, this application, you're going to set up a bunch of permissions for this, right? And for that, look at the target type, and you're actually trying to set up permissions for a task, right? So you can click on the task one right here as a target type, and you just have this one task that you have defined here. So select the hello world test, and you're also going to say what kind of permissions that you want to do on that, right? So in this case, we just need the execute permission. That's all that particular worker needs to. So you can click on execute and then add permission. And when you do that, this is what you'll see here. You see that you have one task called hello world test, and you have set execute permissions for that for an application that you call as Conductor Learning App. The next step is to go and create access keys for these. So when you set up access keys, you get two things. You get a key ID and you get a key secret. And these things are something that you will need to actually copy and store it off somewhere. Just like you do if you're using AWS, you have AWS access keys. It's a very similar concept to that. And as a company, you will have a well-defined way of storing this, like a secrets manager, for example. In this case, I'm just going to use, for simplicity and for demo purposes, I'm just going to use the application properties file and copy that over and go to your application properties, and that's defined under the resources folder right here. And so let's copy that over here. And the second thing is the key secret. Take that over and copy that over here as your secret key. And one other thing that you'll notice here is you also need to specify the Conductor server that you're going that this application is going to be polling and listening to. And if you're using the Orcus Playground, you can set it up pointed to play.orcus.io/API. Also give it a trading slash as well. So that sets up your key ID and secrets. And now let's proceed with actually kicking off workflow. Let's go to your run workflow tab right here, and let's pick up a workflow name. We're trying to do the hello world test workflow. Pick up the latest version. We just have one version for now. And one of the things that you'll notice here is because we had specified that the workflow has input parameters called name, it automatically pulls it up from the definition, puts it up here. Right? So let's give it a name here called Conductor, and then hit. You can also give it a correlation ID, right? This could be an ID that you want to pull up, and if you're running multiple different workflows and you want to correlate them with a single ID, or you have an external ID that you want to correlate that workflow run with, you can type that here. In this example, I'm just going to say Conductor demo. This could be a UUID, freeform ID, whatever you want to put it here. Right? Click on run workflow, and it actually creates a workflow, and this is the ID of that specific workflow run. And when you do that, the first thing you'll notice that like the status of that is actually set up to running. And a quick look at what inputs were supplied to the workflow. So that's the specific value that we gave to the name key. We call it conductor. And if you look at with the diagram section, you see that this is actually waiting for someone to poll and execute this task. So now let's go and kick off our application. And while we do that, let's make sure we have a couple of breakpoints so that I can walk you through this stuff. So we have two breakpoints set here, one when the execute task gets called, and one when we are about to write the output data. All right, so we have started the application, and now we see that we actually put at the breakpoint at the first line of the execute method, and here is where we are right now. Just let's quickly inspect the task properties. All right, so the task type, it's actually defined as this is what we're expecting here. Let's quickly look at the input data as well. And you can see there's this one key, just like we defined in the workflow definition. And the value of that was called conductor, that's passed on in here. And let's go to the next step. Now we have successfully retrieved that, and now we have the value of that in this variable called name. And now let's take that and then add it to the output. And let's do another inspect of the task result, which we're going to return. And if you look at the output data, it has a key called message, and the value of that is called hello world conductor. So let this go through right now. So we now finished the execution. The worker has actually finished the execution of the task. So let's go back to the UI. This was actually set up as running. Let's go refresh this page, and right now it's actually set as completed. And quickly looking at first the workflow input and output. So before we just had the inputs, and now you can actually see that the whole wiring that we set up has actually gone through, and the message that was passed called hello world conductor has been wired in through the task, and the workflow was able to pull the output of the task and set that value as output of the workflow itself. And if you look at the list of tasks that were executed, right, so just one task in that, if you click on the task, you can see a few things, a few details of the task right here. If you look at the inputs, this was the input was just passed to this specific task, and this was the output that came out of it. This was eventually wired in also as output of the workflow itself. You can also get a timeline view of the task. In this case, we just had this one task right here. But if you had 20 or 100 different tasks, like you could see a clean timeline view of exactly what task was executed at what point in time. And we can go over that in a future example. Right? And let's say one of the things you might want to do is while you're debugging stuff, you might want to re-execute this workflow. So you have a couple of options right here. You can go and restart the workflow either with the current definitions or with the latest definitions that's available on that, right? So if you restart it again, right, we got us back to where we had set a breakpoint. Let this go through again. Right now, if you look at the status, it goes back to running. And if you let this go through, come back here, refresh the screen, we've completed that particular execution. So there you go, your very first Hello World application using Conductor and using a Java worker to go and implement that. In the next series of steps, next series of videos, we can go and look at how we can add another task and look at some of the operators that Conductor provides. And we can also go into a simple use case where you can actually mix and match languages across different workers.